Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I've been hiking alone for years. Something about the quiet, the stillness, the absolute emptiness of the wilderness. It's always felt like home to me. But that changed one autumn in the Rocky Mountains. I don't hike alone anymore. Not after what I saw. Not after what followed me. It started like any other trip. I planned a 2-day trek through a less traveled trail. A place off the beaten path where I wouldn't run into weekend warriors or tourists taking selfies. I wanted solitude. And for the first few miles, that's exactly what I got. The trees were a riot of red and orange. The crisp air smelled of pine and damp earth. The sound of my boots crunching over fallen leaves was the only noise breaking the stillness. I should have noticed it earlier. How silent everything was. No birdsong. No rustling of squirrels in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. But I didn't think much of it. Not until I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the trail about 50 feet ahead, completely motionless. I stopped. He wasn't dressed for hiking. Jeans, an old blue jacket that looked soaked through, and heavy boots caked in mud. His arms hung limp at his sides, and his head was tilted just slightly forward. But it was his face that sent ice through my veins. It was pale, too pale, like something leached all the color out of him. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring past me. I turned, my skin prickling. The trail behind me was empty. Nothing but trees, standing like silent sentinels. When I turned back to him, I hesitated. Something about the way he stood, like he was waiting, like he was listening, made my stomach tighten. "Hey," I called out. "Are you okay?" Nothing. A dead silence stretched between us, and I felt the primal urge to back away. But I didn't. I took a step forward instead. Then he moved. Not toward me. He turned his head just slightly. Then, without a sound, he bolted into the trees. It wasn't normal running. It was too fast, too jerky, like his limbs weren't working right, like he was being pulled rather than moving on his own. The way his arms flailed, the way his feet barely seemed to touch the ground. Jesus, I can't explain it, but I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't right. My first instinct should have been to turn around and leave. But instead, I followed. Not into the trees. Hell no. But I walked forward on the trail, trying to convince myself that he was just some lost hiker, maybe in shock, maybe hypothermic. The logical side of my brain tried to make sense of it. The other part of me, the part buried deep in my gut, it was screaming at me to run. That's when I noticed them. Footprints. My own, and another set right next to mine. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. The prints were fresh, deep, distinct impressions in the damp earth. But what made my stomach drop was the fact that they didn't start anywhere. They just appeared, like someone had been walking alongside me the whole time. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. My eyes darted to the trees, scanning the dimming light for anyone, anything, but there was nothing. I walked faster, then jogged. By the time I set up my tent for the night, the sky was an inky black, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. I barely slept. I lay there, knife clutched in my hand, my ears straining in the darkness. Every so often, I swore I could hear it, breathing, deep, raspy, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I told myself it was the wind. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into a restless sleep. But I woke up suddenly. Something was outside. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then, the slow drag of footsteps circling my tent. I gripped my knife, so hard my knuckles ached. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I lay there, praying, please let this be a dream. Please let this be a dream. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged for my flashlight and unzipped the tent, ready to scare off whatever the hell was out there. The beam cut through the trees. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt. No rustling in the underbrush. Nothing. I didn't pack my tent. Didn't even bother. I just grabbed my bag and ran. By the time I reached the trailhead, the first hints of dawn had started creeping into the sky. My chest burned from the cold air. My legs felt like lead. But I didn't stop. Not until I saw my car. And that's when I saw it. Hanging from a low branch, right above my car, was a tattered blue jacket, dripping wet. I stood there, frozen. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that someone else had left it there. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just a jacket. It was a message. I don't hike alone anymore. Story 2. My girlfriend, Rachel, and I love camping in places no one else dared to go. The more remote, the better. We weren't the let's park in a designated campsite and sit around a picnic table type. We wanted the real experience. Just us, the wild, and nothing else. That's how we ended up deep in the Washington State wilderness last spring, hiking off trail to a lake we had seen on the map. It was supposed to be untouched, beautiful, the kind of place no one else knew about. By the time we found the lake, the sun was setting behind the trees, washing the sky in purples and deep reds. The water was still, like a sheet of black glass, reflecting the tall pines surrounding it. Perfect. We set up our tent about 20 feet from the water, made a small fire, and cooked some dinner. I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of peace, just sitting there, listening to the crackling flames and the distant hoot of an owl. It felt like we had the entire world to ourselves. Then, around midnight, we heard it. A whistle. 2 notes. Up and down. Rachel froze mid-sentence, and we both turned toward the trees. The sound had come from the darkness just beyond the tree lean. Not close, but not far either. I forced a chuckle. Must be a bird. I said, though my voice sounded thin, unconvincing. Rachel swallowed. That wasn't a bird. The fire popped, sending a spray of embers into the air. The sound was normal, familiar. That whistle wasn't. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were branches swaying slightly in the night breeze. Nothing unusual. No glowing eyes staring back at us. Then the whistle came again. Closer. Same 2 notes. My skin prickled. I turned off the flashlight, suddenly feeling too exposed. Rachel shifted closer to me. Maybe it's a lost hiker, she whispered. Maybe, I whispered back. But deep in my gut, I knew the truth. We were miles from the nearest trail. No one should have been out here. The fire had burned low now, leaving us in near darkness. I held my breath, listening hard. The silence stretched, the kind that makes your ears ring. Then, behind us, closer this time, came the whistle. Rachel clutched my arm. That was right behind the tent. she breathed. I grabbed my knife from my backpack and rose to my feet, scanning the tree. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. The trees loomed tall and motionless, their trunks like skeletal fingers in the dim light. Then Rachel made a choked noise and pointed. Just beyond the reach of the firelight, half hidden by the trees, stood a figure. Tall, thin, perfectly still. It wasn't holding a flashlight. It wasn't moving. Then, in a voice that sounded wrong, almost mechanical, it repeated the whistle. Perfectly. 2 notes. Up and down. My stomach clenched so hard I thought I might throw up. Rachel was already grabbing at the tent, yanking out the stakes. "We have to go," she hissed. My hands shook as I stuffed whatever I could into my backpack. I didn't dare look up again. The whistle came again, closer. Rachel let out a tiny sob. I zipped up my bag and grabbed her hand. "Run," I whispered. We bolted. Branches whipped at my face. My backpack thumped against my shoulders as we tore through the trees, barely able to see in the dark. I didn't know if we were running in the right direction. I just knew we had to get away. And behind us, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it. The whistle, right on our heels. I forced my legs to move faster, lungs burning, my body screaming at me to stop. The forest felt endless, like a maze of black shapes that all looked the same. But then, through the trees, I saw it, the glint of moonlight on metal. Our car. I fumbled for my keys, hands slick with sweat, and practically threw Rachel inside before jumping in myself. The doors weren't even fully shut before I locked them and turned the engine over. Headlights flooded the trees. Nothing, just the empty woods, standing silent. I let out a shuddering breath, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Rachel was shaking beside me, her face pale. We didn't say a word as I threw the car into reverse and tore out of there. But just as we were about to hit the main road, as the dense trees finally started thinning, we heard it one last time. The whistle. 2 notes. Up, then down, coming from the edge of the woods, right where the trees met the road. Neither of us looked back. We drove the entire night, not stopping until the sun rose, miles away from that godforsaken place. We never reported it, never told anyone, because deep down, we knew there was nothing to report. No one would believe us, and even if they did, some things are better left unknown. Story 3. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe to get it out of my head. Maybe to convince myself it was just a bad dream. But deep down, I know it wasn't. This happened 3 summers ago, during a solo camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains. I'd done a lot of hiking alone before, but this trip changed everything. I had set up camp near a narrow, winding river, the kind of spot you'd see in an outdoor magazine, and think, yeah, that looks peaceful. The trees stretched high above me, their branches forming a canopy that made the forest feel like its own little world. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. After a long day of hiking, I ate a quick meal by the fire and crawled into my tent. My body ached in that good way it does after a day outdoors, and as soon as my head hit the sleeping bag, I was out. Then, sometime during the night, I woke up. I don't know what did it. There was no loud noise, no sudden movement, just a feeling, the kind that coils in your gut and squeezes. The fire had burned down to little more than glowing embers, casting faint shadows on the inside of my tent. Everything was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but wrong quiet. The kind where you suddenly realize you can't hear the wind, or the insects, or anything at all. That's when I saw it. A shadow on my tent. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the shape. A man. Tall, motionless, his silhouette warped slightly by the curve of the fabric. He wasn't moving, not shifting his weight, not adjusting his stance, just standing there, watching me. I stopped breathing. My pulse pounded so loud I thought he'd hear it. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to do something, scream, grab my knife, run. But I couldn't move. I just stared at the shadow, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, in the silence, I heard it, breathing, not my own, slow, shallow, just beyond the thin layer of nylon separating me from the night. I clenched my teeth to keep from making a sound. I had no idea how long he had been standing there. Minutes? Hours? Had he been watching me since I fell asleep? With a shaking hand, I reached for my knife, fingers brushing against the handle. My palm was slick with sweat. If he heard me, if he moved, but he didn't. He just stood there. I don't know what made me do it, but suddenly I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The shadow vanished. I held my breath, waiting for something. Footsteps, movement, the sound of someone running. But there was nothing. Just the dim glow of my flashlight bouncing off the inside of the tent. I waited a full minute before I unzipped the flap. Slowly, carefully. My heart slammed against my ribs as I shone the light outside. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had seen. I knew I wasn't alone. I sat up the rest of the night, my knife clutched in my hand, flashlight resting against my knee. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that shadow, that shape, standing there, unmoving. By the time the sun started to rise, I had already packed up my gear. I wanted to be gone. I wanted to be anywhere but there. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Just a few feet from my tent, the grass was flattened. Not like an animal had passed through. Not like I had stepped there. It was too perfect, like someone had been sitting there, watching me, for who knows how long. I left and never looked back, never went hiking alone again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I get that same feeling, that twist in my gut, that sense that something isn't quite right. And when I glance toward the window, I swear I see a shadow,